Welcome to Retro Reads, where timeless mysteries come to life. Today, a new case awaits, full of twists, secrets, and thrilling revelations. Settle in, relax, and let the adventure begin. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and at what time. Let's get started and dive into this unforgettable story. It was just past 9 when I walked into the kitchen and caught Fritz standing over a silver tin as if it were a Fabergé egg that had learned to hiss. He held it with both hands gingerly, like it might explode if tilted. "Careful," I said. "That looks suspiciously like something you didn't order." He gave me a look over his spectacles, equal parts suspicion and insult. "It came for me," he said. "Hand-delivered?" "No return address. Only this card inside." I took the card, which was printed on thick, cream stock with serifed elegance. To the master of gourmet grace, a sample of future fame. Golden Kernel Confections. Inside the tin, rows of glossy caramel-coated popcorn sat in neat spirals, glistening like lacquered wood. There was a dusting of something pale pink nestled on top. "Pink salt?" I said. "Himalayan, supposedly." He hadn't touched it. Not yet. I had just enough time to suggest burning it in the garden when Wolfe's voice came through the hall. "Fritz, my breakfast?" Fritz straightened. He said he was feeling indulgent today. I raised a brow. Then God help us all. Moments later, I heard Wolfe's footsteps. Not many people believe Wolfe walks, but I can confirm he does on rare occasions when breakfast is involved. He entered, took one look at the tin, and said, "Caramel?" I loathe cloying sweetness. Fritz offered him a single piece, which he took with visible reluctance. He popped it into his mouth, chewed twice, and then froze. "Which brings us to trouble." Wolfe's eyebrows contracted like awnings, folding in a thunderstorm. He swallowed with effort, sat down without ceremony at the kitchen table, and reached for the nearest napkin, though the damage, as it were, had already passed inspection. "Pfui," he muttered. Then, "Fetch a glass of water?" Fritz, alarmed, moved at uncharacteristic speed. I, meanwhile, leaned against the icebox and enjoyed the rare spectacle of Nero Wolfe being bested by a single kernel of corn. It didn't happen often, and when it did, it usually involved poison, or a waiter with opinions. "I told you," Fritz began, but Wolfe cut him off with a raised hand. Number though I was tempted by the Himalayan salt, I admit it. The caramel was inevitable, but there was something bitter. He turned to me. "Archie, retrieve the packaging. Examine it. If this is a prank, it is in poor taste. If it is not, it is an insult." "Insult to your digestive peace or to Fritz's pantry?" "To both, but primarily to Fritz." That, from Wolfe, was practically a flag waved from the barricades. Fritz flushed, bowed his head, and took the tin as if preparing for a sacrificial ritual. I retrieved the inner label from the trash and gave it a once-over. "Golden Kernel Confections," I read aloud. "Brooklyn-based, family-owned, revolutionizing popcorn, one flavor at a time. Sound like assassins to you?" Wolfe scowled, eyes still sharp despite the episode. "Assassins lack the pretension." And just like that, breakfast was over and a vendetta was born. The note tucked inside the tin was a strange hybrid of marketing puffery and something resembling a veiled dare. It read, "To the discerning palate of Mr. Fritz Brenner, we extend this exclusive sample, an unreleased blend of our upcoming savory series. If your kitchen seeks the extraordinary, we invite collaboration. Discretion appreciated." No signature. No contact info beyond a vague website and a P.O. box. For a family company, they seemed fond of mystery. I called the number on their site, only to reach a voicemail thanking me for valuing innovative snacking. No humans, no prompts, no department extensions. Fritz, still looking like a man falsely accused of high treason, hovered beside me as I summarized. "They want you to collaborate," I said. "Sounds like they think you moonlight between soufflés." "I have never collaborated with anyone," Fritz growled, "except Mr. Wolfe." "Tell him that." Wolfe, predictably, had retreated to the orchid room in full sulk and refused my knock twice before allowing me in. The air was thick with humidity and wounded pride. "They sent it to Fritz," I said, "but they clearly knew it would pass through you." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "Then it is not only a poor prank, it is deliberate provocation, cloaked in caramel. Shall I consider it attempted murder?" He didn't smile. "Not murder, but something very near to sabotage," which for Wolfe was the more serious offence. Killing a man was uncivilized, insulting his palate, unforgivable. By noon, the popcorn had been banished from the kitchen, the note placed in a sealed envelope, and Wolfe had declared a moratorium on all further deliveries, edible or otherwise, pending thorough inspection. "I have long suspected," Wolfe said from his chair in the office, "that culinary ambition is as dangerous as political ideology. Both are subject to extremism." I took my seat, notebook in hand. "So you think we've been targeted by radical snackers?" "I think we've been used," he corrected. "For what purpose, I don't yet know. But a man who sends such a concoction either believes he is impressing or offending, and neither deserves leniency. Would you like me to storm their caramel fortress?" "No," he said dryly. "I want facts, background, corporate records. Who owns the company, who works in research, and who might have reason to believe that sending Fritz a poisoned confection would yield anything but scorn." "You think it was poisoned?" "I think it was tampered with. Poison requires intent. This was, experimental, without consent. You've had worse in restaurants." "Yes, but I expected it then." He folded his hands and closed his eyes, which for Wolfe was the equivalent of drawing a dagger. "And Archie, should this turn out to be a publicity stunt, I shall regard it as a declaration of war." Fritz, standing at the doorway with his hands folded like a wronged archbishop, said softly, "It is my fault." "No, Fritz," Wolfe said, "it is theirs, and they shall regret it." At 11:03, just as Wolfe was about to retreat to the orchid room to sulk in botanical silence, a doorbell rang that promised more than ordinary annoyance. I answered it, as is my solemn duty, and found a young woman on the stoop whose composure was as frayed as the hem of her coat. She introduced herself as Melinda Crisp and asked, not too politely, to speak with Mr. Wolfe, not the great detective, not the genius in the brownstone, just Mr. Wolfe. That earned her a raised brow and 5 seconds of study. "I've heard he doesn't like visitors," she added, "but I didn't know where else to go." That particular line, you understand, is number 7 on Wolfe's all-time least favourite opening gambits, but something in her voice, tight, clipped, hovering on the brink of panic, convinced me she wasn't selling anything, or rather, what she was selling might be worth hearing. Wolfe, having only barely recovered from the popcorn incident, was not in the mood for either strangers or stories. I explained this to Miss Crisp. She responded by handing me a sealed plastic pouch filled with caramel popcorn. "I believe someone's trying to poison my company," she said, "and if I'm right, one of your household almost became collateral damage." That earned her an audience. 10 minutes later, she sat across from Wolfe, legs crossed, fingers laced tightly, reciting the beginnings of a tale that smelled less of kernels than of kerosene. Wolfe did not greet her, nor offer refreshment. He listened, eyes half-closed, fingers steepled. "I work at Golden Kernel Confections," she said. "In R&D. We test flavors, compounds, mostly natural, mostly harmless. But last week a batch went out that wasn't approved, and now someone's dead." She paused, not for effect, I think, but because saying it aloud still rattled her. Wolfe opened one eye. "Miss Crisp, are you alleging criminal intent or corporate negligence?" "I'm alleging both," she said. That was enough to keep Wolfe in his chair and out of the orchid room, which, if you know Wolfe, is practically a signed contract. "His name was Trevor Lang," Melinda continued, her voice steadier, now that Wolfe was no longer looking at her as though she were a particularly loud parrot. "He was my colleague in formulation. We worked side by side. He was also a friend. I noted the pause before friend, but didn't interrupt. We'd been working on a savory series, mushroom thyme, chili lime, things like that. Then 2 weeks ago, we got a request from up top. Quentin, our director, said we needed to produce a high-impact tasting prototype for a potential investor. Short deadline, maximum creativity. What's a high-impact taste? I asked. She looked at me with tired eyes. A flavor that lingers, sometimes too long. Wolfe made a low noise, something between a snort and a hum. Go on. We rushed the batch. Trevor had concerns, said the compounds weren't binding correctly. He didn't trust the ingredient list Quentin gave us, but the sample had to go out. We didn't package it ourselves. It was sealed in the small batch room. 3 days later, Trevor collapsed in his lab. They said he choked on a piece of popcorn. He died? I asked. She nodded. Right there, mouthful. It was ruled an accident, but he wasn't careless. And that popcorn? He never touched samples after packaging, not unless he had reason. And you think he did? Wolfe asked. I think he suspected something had been added after we signed off. Wolfe shifted his weight, not much, but enough to creak the leather arm of his chair. Did he tell you this? Number, but he left me notes. They weren't detailed, but it was clear he was planning to raise a red flag. And instead, I said, he choked on a caramel grenade. Melinda didn't smile. I think someone used him to test what they couldn't risk in public. Wolfe inhaled deeply through his nose, then exhaled through pursed lips. Fritz, he said without turning his head, make a note. Caramel is now off the menu. That earned him a weak smile from her, and a silent glare from Fritz, hovering near the archway with visible restraint. Melinda pulled a folded paper from her coat pocket and handed it to Wolfe. It was a photocopy of an internal memo from Golden Kernel Confections, signed by Quentin Foley, Director of Product Strategy. The title, Ingredient Integration Beyond Standard Protocol. It doesn't say much, I said, after glancing over it, except that somebody wanted to bend a few rules. Quentin wanted speed, Melinda said. Trevor wanted safety. I think you can guess who won. Wolfe tapped the paper against his palm. Foley, what do you know of him? She gave a brittle laugh. What don't I know? He's charming, he's ambitious, he hates regulation, and he thinks scientists are there to facilitate his culinary vision. That's a phrase I already despise, Wolfe murmured. He wants to make Golden Kernel a luxury brand, she went on. Not just popcorn in tins, but edible experiences. He's been working with molecular gastronomists, people who used to work in fragrance, not food. That's how we got the umami compounds. Was Trevor part of that team? I asked. Number, he didn't trust it. Neither did I, but I needed the job. And Trevor didn't know when to keep quiet. Wolfe opened a drawer and dropped the memo inside. Miss Crisp, you have accused your superior of malfeasance, hinted at manslaughter, and implicated an entire flavor profile in what may be criminal negligence or premeditated harm. Why are you here? Her eyes met his. Because whoever sent that popcorn to Fritz was testing something, and if that batch matches what Trevor ate, you may be next. That silenced even Wolfe for a moment. Then he nodded once. Archie, have Saul make inquiries, quietly, and inform Kramer, but not urgently. I raised a brow. You're taking the case. No, Wolfe said. I'm protecting my household. Melinda stood, hesitant. So you believe me? I believe, Wolfe said, that only a fool would weaponize popcorn, which means we're dealing with someone far more dangerous. She left quietly, the air still tense. I looked at Wolfe. Savory series, huh? He closed his eyes. If I die by truffle dust, he said, let it be known I was murdered. Wolfe has a talent for indifference that borders on performance art, but there are limits, even for him. And Fritz Brenner's culinary honor being impugned, however indirectly, turned out to be one of them. He had remained seated long after Melinda Crisp left, fingers steepled, eyes closed, exhaling the kind of prolonged, nasal sigh that usually precedes a resolution to avoid involvement altogether. I stayed quiet out of respect and curiosity. Wolfe rarely rushes his pivots. At length he stirred. "You will have Saul obtain records of Golden Colonel's executive structure," he said. "I want Foley's resume and the source of their compound contracts." "That sounds suspiciously like work," I said. He opened one eye. "I am not taking the case." "Of course not. I am defending this household from a culinary attack." "Absolutely. Fritz," he added, raising his voice slightly, "you are to dispose of all unopened deliveries unless they are from confirmed sources, no exceptions." Fritz, who had been quietly polishing silver 2 rooms away, as he does when disturbed, entered to nod solemnly. "Understood?" "I have no wish to attend your funeral," Wolfe added. "You are intolerable enough alive." Fritz inclined his head with the gravity of a priest absorbing a benediction. I waited until Fritz left, then said, "You're not convinced Melinda is lying?" "No," Wolfe said. "But she is hiding something, perhaps sentiment, perhaps self-preservation." "And if she's right?" Wolfe's lips tightened. "Then a man is dead from more than hubris, and the next colonel may yet be aimed at me." He rose, not quickly, but with deliberate weight, as if the very act signified engagement. I've seen Wolfe bested by language, by logic, by an overcooked soufflé, but never by intimidation. He moved to his desk and buzzed Saul's number. "Poison in popcorn," he muttered. "How unworthy, how perfectly American." I cracked my knuckles. "So we're popping in?" He gave me a glower so sharp it might have seasoned its own caramel, and just like that, we were officially neck-deep in snacks, sabotage, and what Wolfe called, with contempt and precision, the idiocy of novelty cuisine. I've met my fair share of charmers. The trouble with them is that they always make you feel like you're the only person in the room, until they pivot, and you realize they've made everyone else feel that way too. Quentin Foley, director of product strategy at Golden Colonel Confections, was exactly that sort of charmer. Tall, smooth-voiced, with just enough stubble to suggest creativity and just enough starch in his collar to remind you he ran the place. He greeted me in their Brooklyn headquarters, which was a cross between a tech startup and a French patisserie. Neon signage, open glass walls, a test kitchen visible from the front lobby, and a faint aroma of burnt sugar and vanilla, like someone had tried to sanitize ambition with dessert. "You're not here for a tour, I take it?" Foley asked, leading me into his office. "No," I said, "unless you serve poison samples on silver trays." He gave a laugh so well practiced it might have been catered. "I heard about the tin that reached your employer," he said. "Truly unfortunate. Not intended for public or private consumption yet. A clerical mix-up. Most clerical errors don't taste like Himalayan salt and despair." His smile didn't flicker. "We're a flavor-forward company, Mr. Goodwin. Mistakes happen, but I assure you we take safety seriously. As for Miss Crisp's theories, let's just say Melinda is brilliant, but not exactly stable." I made a note. Whenever someone praises a colleague's talent while questioning their mental health, they're not just dodging, they're aiming. "And Trevor Lang?" I asked. Foley sighed theatrically. "A terrible loss, but choking on food in a flavor lab isn't unheard of. Occupational hazard, you might say." I didn't say it. Instead, I asked about the packaging process, chain of custody, and internal quality checks. Foley gave me answers that were technically sound and practically useless. He ended the meeting with a smile and a complimentary bag of butter truffle popcorn. I didn't take it. Outside, I called Wolfe and said, "Foley's as smooth as caramel and twice as sticky. If he's innocent, I'm the Queen of Belgium." Wolfe replied, "Then your Majesty will continue, please." Foley had brushed me off with polish and polish's close cousin, pretense. But if charm was the facade, the test kitchen was the back alley where the flavor got dirty, so I went there next. Dr. Noah Glenn was not what I expected. Mid-40s, wiry, lab coat meticulously buttoned, and the kind of face that suggested he'd invented bitterness long before it was trendy. "Miss Crisp sent you, didn't she?" he said, before I'd offered my name. She mentioned your name. She would? He returned to whatever powder he was weighing with a practiced indifference that made Wolfe look emotionally available by comparison. I understand you worked closely with Trevor Lang. He didn't look up. Trevor was competent. Past tense. Yes, tragically. His tone suggested the tragedy was more bureaucratic than emotional. I poked a little harder. Did you notice anything unusual about Trevor's behavior before his death? No more than usual. He was thorough, cautious, annoying, always wanted second approvals when one would suffice. And Melinda? Now he did look up. His eyes were pale, almost colourless, like the powder he was blending. She's a chemist with talent and a taste for drama, thinks rules are made to be rewritten. By her. You don't like her, I observed. I don't trust her, he said flatly. Chemistry is precision. Melinda prefers improvisation. That's not science. That's theatre. Did you see the memo she gave us about ingredient integration? He snorted. Foley's vanity project. The man wants his popcorn to smell like perfume and taste like revolution. I wouldn't be surprised if someone got hurt. Trevor, for instance? He shrugged, then went back to mixing powders. If you're looking for villains, Mr. Goodwin, try upstairs. That's where the egos are. He wasn't lying exactly. But his indifference had too much frost on it to be completely clean. Back in the hallway, I made another call to Wolfe. He doesn't mourn Trevor, and he doesn't trust Melinda, I said. Did he taste the batch? Wolfe asked. No idea. Find out. He hung up, and I made a mental note to bring my own snacks for the foreseeable future. There was something in the air here beyond the sugar and salt. It smelled like competition. When you want to find out how a man got rich, don't start with his press clippings. Start with the people he used to work for, especially if he left them in the lurch with a flavor formula in one hand and a non-compete clause in the other. That's why the morning after my chat with Glenn, I took a leisurely stroll down to Kettle King's, a boutique popcorn outfit run by two brothers named Hal and Marvin Rook. Their operation was small but smelled like success, or at least burnt sugar and bravado. Hal did most of the talking, and his tone had the familiar undertone of a man who'd once taught someone how to swim, only to be pushed off a dock years later. Foley? He said when I mentioned the name. He was with us for a year, said he wanted to elevate the brand. That meant twice the price and a flavor that made your eyes water. He developed something here? Caramel chipotle, Marvin chimed in. Not a bad blend, just didn't belong on popcorn, or anything edible. And when he left, Hal grimaced. Started his golden kernel vision 3 weeks later with a slightly more refined version of our chipotle blend and a patent pending. He said it was inspired by his work here. I say it was theft. Did you file suit? We filed complaints. Nothing stuck. I nodded, watching as Marvin stirred a copper kettle in the back with the concentration of a surgeon. Ever hear of him dabbling in less legal ingredients? I asked. Hal's eyes narrowed. We keep it clean. Foley? He wants headlines, doesn't care how he gets them. That tracked with the rest of the picture, a man chasing innovation with just enough ethics to stay out of court, but not out of trouble. As I left, Hal added, if he's finally cooked something too hot, don't come asking us to mourn. Back in the cab, I called Wolfe to report. He's got enemies, I said. Of course, Wolfe replied. A man who flavors popcorn with ambition and betrayal is bound to season his career with grudges. Back at Golden Kernel, I made a friendly nuisance of myself until I was escorted into the office of their operations manager, a sour man named Tate who smelled like packaging tape and wore a Bluetooth earpiece like it was welded to his skull. I told him I was following up on procedural inconsistencies tied to a particular batch of popcorn, namely, the one that made Wolfe consider banning caramel for life. We log everything, Tate said, without enthusiasm. Footage, weights, packaging dates. Great, I said. Let's take a look. He sighed, tapped keys, and brought up a series of time-stamped video files. Everything was there until it wasn't. There's a gap, I said, pointing at the screen. Batch 112-A, which should have been logged around 3:45 p.m. on Thursday. That slot's missing. He clicked, frowned, clicked again. Looks like the file was overwritten. Automatically? Not unless someone manually flagged it for deletion. I leaned in. Someone like a chemist with something to hide, or an ambitious executive looking to send a sample to a private address? Tate didn't answer. His silence did the talking. I thanked him for his unintentional cooperation and stepped outside to make my report. Wolfe's voice came through, calm and cool. Missing footage, Archie, is more damning than forged footage. It confesses without saying a word. I said, Maybe the popcorn wasn't the only thing doctored. Wolfe grunted. Continue. Someone is writing a recipe for regret. When Fritz called me from the kitchen, his tone had the sharpness he usually reserves for poorly labelled herbs or water that dares to boil unevenly. I tested the remaining popcorn, he said. The bitterness was not an accident. Wolfe and I met him at the dining table, where he had neatly separated flakes of caramel, powdered seasonings, and a few stubborn kernels that had survived my earlier attempts at evidence tampering. There's a mineral content here, Fritz explained, tapping a tiny glass dish. Distinctly non-commercial. I checked our pantry. Nothing matches. Salt? Wolfe asked. Yes, but not ordinary. It's fused with an iron trace, earthy, like volcanic residue. That narrowed the list considerably. Fritz handed me a note with his findings. It looked like something a forensic geologist might dream up after an argument with a chef. I took the sample to an old friend at an independent spice importer on East 28th. He confirmed it. A specialty blend used in exactly one local recipe. Kettle Kings, he said. They call it lava salt trademark. Good branding, terrible taste. Back at the brownstone, I delivered the news. Wolfe's eyes opened, both of them, which meant something had snapped into place. They stole the flavor, I said. They didn't just steal it, Wolfe muttered. They weaponized it. He tapped his chin, which is as close to swearing as Wolfe gets. If our sample matches theirs, he said, someone used proprietary salt as a signature or a setup. The flavor war, it seemed, had gone from petty to poisonous. The next morning, Saul Panzer called with a report that didn't need dramatics to make it interesting. I followed Glenay last night, he said. He met Melinda Crisp at a cafe on 2nd and Bond. No disguises, no handlers. That's cozy, I said. Not for long. They talked for 15 minutes, mostly quiet. He was agitated. She was careful. Was it romantic? Saul snorted. If so, it's the worst courtship I've ever seen. She gave him something in an envelope. He looked panicked. She left first. I relayed it all to Wolfe, who listened with the expression of a man trying to distinguish a symphony from static. Miss Crisp implied she had no recent contact with Glenn, he said finally. She implied plenty, I corrected. What she actually said was very little. Indeed, Wolfe said. Lies by omission are still lies, and often more artful. What do you think she gave him? I think, Wolfe murmured. We're 1 step from clarity and 2 steps from collapse. That was the beauty of a Wolfe case. The deeper you went, the more tangled it got, until everything, somehow, folded into place. And something told me Melinda Crisp wasn't just a whistleblower in the popcorn business. She might be holding the match that lit the whole caramel fire. The call came through Saul at 7:42 a.m., which is considered the dead of night in the Wolfe household. I had just finished my first cup of coffee and was debating whether breakfast could wait 10 more minutes when Saul's voice informed me that Dr. Noah Glenn, Golden Colonel's resident mood killer and bitter powder mixer, had been found dead in his lab. Cause? I asked. Unclear, Saul replied. But he collapsed during a formulation test. Word is he was working on a new umami powder, alone, no witnesses. Wolfe was already in the orchid room when I broke the news. He didn't react immediately, but a leaf he was misting got more attention than it deserved. Umami, he said slowly. An elusive taste, when done properly. When done improperly, I waited. He didn't finish the sentence, which was Wolfe's version of a dramatic pause. "What do we know?" he finally asked. Saul's still digging, but Glenn was mid-test. No one saw it, probably after hours. The cleaning staff found him early this morning. Lab notes are missing. "Of course they are." Wolfe handed me the mister. "Continue." "The thing about death in a flavor lab is that it sounds like satire until the police get involved. And by noon, they had. Lieutenant Kramer phoned, not politely, and asked if Wolfe had recently received any proprietary food products from Golden Colonel. I confirmed he had. Then he confirmed something in return. Glenn was testing the same batch your man sampled. That didn't sit well with Wolfe. In fact, he sat down in silence for nearly 4 minutes. "Tell Kramer," he said at last, "that I did not invite poison into my home. But if someone delivered it, I shall return it, intellectually wrapped and tightly knotted." I didn't mention that Kramer preferred knots he could yank tight in court. Wolfe's knots required chess and sherry. Still, Glenn being dead was more than inconvenient. It was catalytic. By early afternoon, the doorbell rang with the weight of inevitability. I opened it to find Lieutenant Kramer standing there with his usual blend of discomfort and righteousness, as though showing up at Wolfe's door cost him a layer of skin. He brushed past me, hat in hand, but didn't sit. "You knew him?" he asked Wolfe, standing with arms crossed like a judge who'd misplaced his gavel. "I met him once," Wolfe replied. "In passing. It was not memorable." "Well, he's dead now," Kramer snapped. "Collapsed last night, and the compound he was working on matches the formula in that popcorn tin you received." I presumed as much. "You didn't think to mention it?" "I had no data to support it. Now I do. Thank you." That didn't help Kramer's mood. He turned to me. "You still have the packaging?" "In cold storage," I said. "Labeled as Exhibit A, regrettable snack." Kramer didn't smile. "This is serious. We're talking about a potential toxin introduced to a food product in a commercial lab." "Intentional?" Wolfe asked. "We don't know yet." "Then don't waste your breath on supposition." Kramer looked like he might explode, but somehow swallowed it. "If it's connected, I want statements, every delivery detail, every contact, and I want that sample." "You'll get a copy," Wolfe said. "Not enough." "Then get a warrant." Kramer glared. "You think this is a joke?" "No, but I do think someone hoped I'd eat that colonel and follow Dr. Glenn's path. That is not a joke. It is a provocation, and I do not respond well to provocations." "You're not above the law, Wolfe." "I am beneath its notice, provided I am cooperative, and I shall be, so long as you are competent." That was Wolfe's version of diplomacy. Kramer knew it. He grumbled and took his leave. When the door shut behind him, Wolfe turned to me. "Someone has committed a murder," he said. "But not for revenge, not yet. This was about control, suppression." I said, "And the poison?" He nodded once. "Was proof, and Glenn, I think, knew it." Kramer returned the next morning, not with a warrant, but with a bad temper, which in his case served about the same function. He didn't wait for my invitation before barging into the office. I followed close behind, resisting the urge to bring popcorn for atmosphere. "You're holding back," he said to Wolfe before the door had fully closed. "And if I find out you've tampered with evidence—" "Don't be ridiculous," Wolfe interrupted, barely glancing up from his desk. "Tampering requires manual labor." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "You had access to the same batch that Glenn was testing. You've had it for days. You don't find that suspicious?" "I find your persistence admirable and your logic lacking." Kramer shifted his glare to me. "And you, what have you dug up that I haven't heard about?" I gave him my most innocent smile. "Just an appreciation for caramel I never thought I'd lose." That earned me a scowl. He turned back to Wolfe. "Look, I get it. You hate being involved unless it suits your ego, but a man is dead, possibly murdered, and that popcorn may have been the weapon, so if your chef took a bite and survived, he's a material witness, and if anything happens to him, I'll come back here with more than questions." At that, Fritz entered from the hallway, carrying a tray of coffee. He paused, caught the tension, and narrowed his eyes. Wolfe sat forward. Fritz's judgment is unerring, his palate refined. He would not have served anything unworthy of this house unless he'd been deceived. And that is the matter of interest here. Kramer snorted. So someone deceived your chef, and that's your reason for stepping in? It is more than sufficient. The lieutenant didn't buy it, but he didn't argue either. He took a cup of coffee, without asking, and stood there like a man waiting to be shown out. I obliged. As the door closed behind him, Wolfe muttered, "Kramer blunders like a man chasing fireflies with a sledgehammer." I said, "You know he's going to have the lab sample the remaining popcorn." "Good," Wolfe said. "Let them taste what happens when ambition is powdered and caramelized." Saul called from a payphone near the East River. He never says where he is unless it matters, and in this case it did. "I've got something," he said. Foley's name turned up on a lease, not under Golden Colonel, private holding, 3 levels deep, but I traced it. Small warehouse in Gowanus, leased 6 months ago. Lab renovations, industrial sink install, soundproofing. Golden Colonel's expanding? I asked. No signage, no permitting, no corporate filings, just a lease, a locksmith, and a lot of insulation. That was enough to make Wolfe lift both eyebrows when I relayed it. "Why soundproofing?" I asked. "To prevent interruption," Wolfe said, "or to conceal experimentation." "Chemical?" "Perhaps, possibly culinary, but almost certainly not legal." I pressed Saul for more. "I haven't gotten inside yet," he said. "Security's tight. Keypad entry, internal locks, no external branding. But I did see someone going in, Foley himself, carrying a metal briefcase." I asked Wolfe if we should alert Kramer. "No," he said immediately. "Not yet. Kramer's intervention at this stage would be like asking a walrus to inspect crystal." "What do you think Foley's cooking?" Wolfe leaned back. "Something he doesn't want Melinda Crisp or the FDA to know about." The warehouse lease made it clear Golden Colonel was running a parallel operation. Whether it was culinary innovation or criminal negligence remained to be seen, but the existence of an off-the-books lab suggested that Dr. Glenay's death was no accident of gluttony. And I had a sneaking suspicion that popcorn wasn't the only thing being tested there. That afternoon, I returned to Golden Colonel on a hunch, and because Wolfe had issued one of his rare imperatives, find what Glenn left behind. The man's office was locked, but not sealed, and I've picked enough locks in my time to know the difference between security and formality. Inside it was tidy, too tidy for a chemist in the middle of experimental madness, which meant someone had already cleaned it. But they'd missed something. A plain black burner phone sat wedged behind a jar of flavor capsules on the back shelf. I turned it on and checked the call log. Only 3 outgoing calls. The last one had been placed the night of Glenay's death, at 9:42 p.m., to Melinda Crisp. I stared at the number and tried not to jump to conclusions, but when your dead chemist leaves behind an unregistered phone and the final call connects directly to your client, it doesn't take much acrobatics. Back at the brownstone, I handed Wolfe the phone. "He called her," I said, "right before he died." "He didn't call to gossip," Wolfe replied. "What did he say?" I shrugged. "I can ask her." "Number, not yet. She may not know we know." Wolfe turned the phone over, inspecting it like a beetle under glass. "The silence of the dead is often less troubling than the silence of the living." "Think she's in on it?" "I think," he said, "she has withheld information. Whether out of fear or guilt is the question." We both looked at the burner phone sitting quietly on Wolfe's blotter, mute and incriminating. Some truths ring out. Others whisper. This one had said just enough. Later that evening, Wolfe called me into the dining room, where Fritz had laid out an array of spice jars, powder blends, and test samples arranged like evidence on a sideboard. "I've been thinking," Wolfe said, "about Dr. Glenn's habits. A man of his rigidity would not have consumed the popcorn casually." "So you think he didn't eat the batch that killed him?" "Precisely. Glenn, by all accounts, didn't trust packaged product. He would have tested ingredients individually. He motioned to the powder samples Fritz had reconstituted from what remained in our tin. "This one," he said, "was mixed with the caramel coating. The sweetness would mask almost anything, but this—" He pointed to a separate sample, dry and reddish-brown. "This is pure, bitter, concentrated. Too much for popcorn," I said. "Too much for anything except deliberate masking." Wolfe folded his hands. "I believe the killer knew Glenay's methods. They knew he would isolate each component. Which means the fatal dose wasn't in the finished product. It was in the raw material." "Powder over popcorn," I said. "He tasted it direct." Wolfe nodded. "And whoever delivered that powder knew him well enough to exploit that." "So who else knew Glenay's testing style?" "That," Wolfe said, "is what you will now determine." He rose from the table, which he rarely does before dessert, and added, "And while you're at it, find out who had access to that powder after it left the formulation lab. Glenay's death wasn't random or collateral. It was surgical. The weapon wasn't the kernel. It was the chemistry. If you've never seen Wolfe summon suspects to the brownstone, let me explain how it works. There are no warrants, no demands, and certainly no threats. He simply issues invitations, courteously worded, politely firm, and waits. They always come. It's not because they're intimidated, though many are. It's because Wolfe crafts his invitations like puzzles. Refusing to attend feels like stepping out of a game you might have already lost. And no one likes forfeiting when the stakes include murder and exposure. By that Thursday afternoon, we had the perfect guest list. Melinda crisp, tense and smartly dressed. Quentin Foley, groomed and cool, a half step too relaxed. Lieutenant Kramer, invited out of both necessity and provocation. Fritz, in his customary silence, and Saul, quiet and watchful, positioned by the bookshelves as if merely browsing history. Wolfe didn't rise to greet anyone. That, of course, would have been absurd. He simply looked up from his chair, fingers steepled, and said, "Thank you for coming." Foley offered a half-smile. "I wasn't aware we had a choice." "You didn't," Wolfe replied, "but you had the illusion." "I thought it best to maintain your comfort." Kramer growled. "You said this was about clearing your name." "It is. And about clarifying a death, possibly two. And a third, narrowly avoided by Mr. Brenner." Melinda fidgeted. I caught it. Wolfe continued, "We have popcorn, powders, proprietary salts, hidden leases, and the sudden absence of a man who knew too much. That convergence is not coincidence. It is choreography. And the dancer, I suspect, is in this room." He paused, then added, "I assure you this is not theatre. I do not enjoy theatrics, but I do appreciate truth." The silence that followed was rich enough to spoon. Then Wolfe looked at me and said, "Archie, perhaps you'll help our guests recall what they've forgotten." I nodded and scanned the room, ready to apply my particular brand of persuasion. And it didn't take long to find the first crack. Of all the people in that room, only one wasn't pretending to be somewhere else. Kramer was chewing on the inside of his cheek. Fritz was unreadable. Saul was Saul. And Melinda was twisting her fingers into an invisible knot. But Foley, that polished professional with the PR smile, had lost a sliver of his cool. Not much, just enough to register if you were trained to catch it. His left shoe bounced, heel to floor, in quiet syncopation. His gaze wandered too frequently to the French doors. And when Wolfe mentioned the phrase, "poison by powder," Foley glanced at Melinda with something that looked less like curiosity and more like measurement. "Mr. Foley," I began, stepping forward just far enough to get in his periphery, "when exactly did you learn that Dr. Glenn had died?" "That morning," he replied smoothly. "Tate called me. I was shocked." "Were you? You didn't seem particularly broken up about it when I asked you 2 days ago." "I manage a company, Mr. Goodwin. I'm not paid to weep publicly." "No, just to package it in caramel and call it innovation." That got a cough from Kramer and a sharp look from Melinda. Foley gave me the kind of smile you save for waiters who forget your wine. Let's not pretend Glenn was beloved, he said. He was rigid, paranoid. He obstructed progress. Wolfe's voice broke in, low and even. Did he obstruct your private lab? Foley blinked. Excuse me? Wolfe opened a drawer and produced the lease Saul had uncovered. A secret facility, soundproofed, paid through a shell. Why? Foley straightened. I was developing a parallel line, proprietary blends with no oversight, Wolfe asked. With discretion. And was Glennie's discretion inconvenient? Foley said nothing. Kramer leaned forward. You tell me now if that lab had anything to do with that poisoned batch, or I'll shut the whole place down. Wolfe raised a hand. Lieutenant, let us not pounce prematurely. The truths we seek are not elusive, merely shy. Foley's smile didn't recover. He sat back, eyes darker now, foot stilled. I made a mental note. He was sweating, and not from the heat, and the caramel was cracking. Melinda Crisp was sitting straight-backed in the red leather chair opposite Wolfe, her chin tilted up just enough to suggest pride, though her fingers betrayed a restlessness that didn't match her poise. Wolfe studied her like he was inspecting a rare orchid for disease. Miss Crisp, he said, you've told us you and Dr. Glenn were colleagues, not confidants. Yet the final call from his burner phone was to you. She froze. Not theatrically, just a flicker, the kind you'd miss unless you were waiting for it. I didn't answer it, she said. I was asleep. Wolfe grunted. Then why not disclose it? I didn't think it mattered, Kramer interjected. It matters now. She turned to Wolfe. I didn't kill him, and I didn't lie, I just omitted. Omissions, Wolfe murmured, are often more revealing than declarations, and your omission, Miss Crisp, invites inference. Foley shifted in his chair but said nothing. Wolfe pressed on. You gave Glennie something at that cafe, an envelope. What was it? Her voice dropped. Notes from our flavor trials. He was worried something had been changed in the batch that went to you. I thought if he had my records, he'd see it wasn't from our team. Did you tell Foley you'd done that? No. Foley finally snapped. Why would she? She was always insubordinate. Running scared. Indeed, Wolfe said, his gaze sharpening. Scared of what? Melinda looked down. Trevor warned me. Said if anything happened to Glenn, I might be next. I didn't think he meant it literally. You knew more than you admitted, I said. You were in this up to your elbows. I was trying to stay alive, she snapped. That batch? You think it was sent to Wolfe by accident? I think it was a test. For someone, for something. And Glenn failed it, Wolfe said quietly. She didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Right on cue, Saul spoke from behind his preferred bookshelf. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes, which made his voice all the more effective, low, calm, and lethal. I found your ghost, Mr. Foley. Foley blinked. Excuse me? His name is Javier Torres, night shift custodian at Golden Colonel, retired Navy, quiet, keeps to himself, happened to be working the day your infamous batch was packaged, also happens to have taken a cash deposit 2 days later, delivered in a plain white envelope, pulled from his locker yesterday. Foley's mouth opened, then closed. Saul continued. He didn't spend it. Said he didn't know what it was for, just that someone paid him to delete a single data file from the packaging log and said he'd get another envelope if he stayed quiet. Kramer straightened in his chair. You telling me you've got that envelope? Delivered it to the precinct this morning, Saul said. Fingerprint analysis pending. Wolfe nodded with satisfaction. Thank you, Mr. Panzer. Foley was now fully sweating, which in Wolfe's office was a cardinal sin. His voice, when it came, was brittle. You can't tie that to me. Oh? Wolfe said. Javier described the man who gave him the envelope. Slim, sharp-suited, expensive watch, no tie. Sound familiar? Foley looked at Melinda, then at Kramer. This is a circus. No, Wolfe said. This is a demonstration. A batch was poisoned, logs were deleted, and a man who stood in your way was found dead with a powder you pushed for. Circumstantial. Perhaps. But damning nonetheless. Kramer leaned forward. You better come clean, Foley, or I'll bury you in subpoenas. Foley sneered. You think I'd poison a man over popcorn? No, Wolfe said. Over control. Silence again, except for the subtle creak of leather as Foley shifted in his chair. And somewhere in that moment, the scent of guilt replaced the scent of caramel. Wolfe, whose tolerance for prolonged tension rivals his tolerance for lukewarm consommé, let silence stretch until it thinned into something sharp. Then, with the weight of inevitability, he shifted forward in his chair. I will now speak plainly. The room did what it always did when Wolfe announced that. It stilled. Quentin Foley had a problem. A chemist, Glenn, who would not cooperate, and a product, an experimental batch that required trial without traceability. The solution? A limited, targeted delivery, not for market testing, not for the public, for containment, specifically Glenn's. Foley sat rigid, his expression teetering between disdain and fear. Wolfe went on. Miss Crisp, whether she knew it or not, facilitated the conditions. The compound was altered after formulation, possibly in the facility we now know exists outside Golden Colonel's sanctioned operations. Kramer grunted. And Glenn was the intended target. Exactly. The poisoned compound was delivered in the form Glenn would naturally test, a raw powder sample. But to mislead, and to ensure no connection to the private lab, it was also embedded in a caramel coating. The batch sent to me under the guise of a marketing stunt was part of that deception. But why send it here? Melinda asked. Wolfe's tone tightened. Because it was not intended for me. All eyes snapped to him. He didn't elaborate, not yet. He let it hang, an intellectual cliff, not for drama but for precision. The batch was crafted for one purpose, to silence Glenn. It was never meant for consumer release. That is why the surveillance footage was erased, why the logs were scrubbed, why Mr. Torres received his envelope. And if Fritz hadn't sampled it, I asked. Then I might have, Wolfe replied, and the outcome might have aligned with the saboteur's expectations. Foley opened his mouth, but the denial died before it reached air. Wolfe looked to Kramer. The motive was not money, nor even reputation, it was control. Glenn threatened the secrecy of the rogue lab that could not be tolerated. Melinda's voice came low. He told me he was scared, but I thought he was just being Glenn. Wolfe closed his eyes. Paranoia, Miss Crisp, is sometimes another word for foresight. The method, Wolfe continued, was as calculated as the motive. He gestured toward a silver dish on his desk, where Fritz had arranged sample fragments of the caramel popcorn we'd all come to distrust. The poison was not laced throughout, he said. That would have risked uniform dispersion and early detection. Instead, it was infused in the caramel coating, deliberately patchy. Why? No one spoke, so he answered. Because caramel melts, especially under heat. A seemingly harmless kernel in cool conditions becomes lethal after 10 minutes in a warm lab. Glenn, known for tasting individual ingredients, would sample it warm, softened, reactive. Kramer muttered. Ingenious. Insidious, Wolfe corrected. He took a breath. The compound was likely temperature-activated, stable in storage, volatile in the mouth. That explains the absence of symptoms in Fritz. He refrigerated the tin before opening it. I added, and served it cold, straight from the tin. Glenn would have done the opposite. Precisely. Melinda looked pale now. So it was planned? Someone knew exactly how he tested. Wolfe nodded, which narrows the suspect pool considerably. He glanced at Foley, whose silence had grown taut enough to hum. Either Mr. Foley possessed that level of insight, or someone acting on his behalf did. Saul cleared his throat. I spoke to the lab manager. Glenn always warmed his samples, called it palate calibration. Everyone knew. Wolfe made a small, satisfied noise. Then the poisoner used caramel for more than flavor. It served as both disguise and delivery. In sweetening, it killed. Kramer leaned forward. You think Foley mixed it? No. Wolfe said. He commissioned it. Someone else handled the substance. Melinda? I asked. Wolfe shook his head. She lacks the precision, but not the guilt. And that, as far as Wolfe was concerned, was a distinction worth everything. Let us be clear, Wolfe said, his voice slow and final. That tin was not meant for me. He turned to Fritz. It was addressed to you. Fritz gave a solemn nod. Wolfe continued, but the delivery instructions, those we acquired from the courier, originally listed the name Dr. N. Glenn. The address was altered at dispatch, digitally overwritten, likely by someone who knew the internal systems. Kramer frowned. You're saying the killer sent it to Glenn, then rerouted it to you? No, Wolfe said. The killer believed it would still reach Glenn. It didn't. He turned his gaze to Melinda. Someone intercepted that transfer, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear. She didn't answer, but her silence thickened. Wolfe concluded, Glenn A. died anyway from another dose, placed directly. But the original plan, subtle, untraceable, caramelized, missed its mark. And in missing, it landed at Wolfe's table, almost poetic, almost fatal. When Wolfe refers to a gathering as a conference-y, it typically means a polite interrogation wrapped in parlor decorum. But when he calls it a confrontation, you know the gloves, if not the manners, are off. The atmosphere in the office that evening was thick enough to spread on toast. Wolfe sat immobile in his oversized chair, fingers steepled just below his chin. Saul stood like a bookend near the globe, arms folded. Kramer parked himself by the credenza, radiating suspicion. Melinda Crisp clutched her handbag like a flotation device, and Quentin Foley, hair immaculate and tie unnecessarily perfect, pretended the air wasn't pressing down on his collar. Fritz, quietly dignified, stood just outside the doorway, invited not as suspect, witness, or staff, but as the man who had, unintentionally, almost died of desert. Wolfe spoke only once everyone had seated themselves, save for Saul, who preferred the vertical advantage. I have asked you here, Wolfe began, not for courtesy, but necessity. We are on the brink of conclusion, and it is best, though not essential, that the truth arrive in your presence. Foley exhaled lightly. Are we going to be treated to another theory, Mr. Wolfe? No, Mr. Foley, Wolfe said, without looking at him. You are going to be treated to a verdict. That shut him up. I believe the events surrounding Dr. Glennie's death, the corrupted batch of popcorn, and the tampered security logs form not a puzzle, but a recipe. A deliberate, measured concoction of motive, method, and manipulation. He gestured subtly toward me. I handed him the tin, the infamous tin. This was never meant to be tasted by the public, Wolfe continued. It was a silent execution, dressed as innovation. Dr. Glenn was an obstacle, one with access, knowledge, and, fatally, integrity. Melinda stirred. Kramer frowned. Foley blinked twice and smiled with one side of his mouth. Wolfe ignored them. I have identified the murderer. I do not require a confession, but I will accept one. He paused. Silence. Then, as expected, he spoke again. Let us begin with motive. There is no murder without motive, Wolfe intoned, and no motive as potent, nor as vulgar, as power. He nodded once in my direction, which was his version of proceed. I rose and faced the room, where 4 faces absorbed the temperature in their own ways. Kramer looked mildly interested, like a man at a dull wedding with the suspicion that the cake will be excellent. Saul stood motionless. Melinda was holding her breath, and Foley wore the polished glaze of a man who knows he's on trial but hasn't yet decided whether to run or perform. Let's talk about Glenn, I said. The good doctor didn't like shortcuts, especially chemical ones, especially ones cooked in off-the-books labs leased by private subsidiaries. Sound familiar, Mr. Foley? Foley raised a brow. We all explore avenues of research. Some of them remain proprietary. Not when your head chemist threatens to expose them, Wolfe said. That's not proprietary, that's precarious. I continued. Glen had plans, notes, documentation, enough to ruin your pitch to your newest investor, someone we confirmed was touring the lab that week. Melinda murmured. He was going to make it public. Indeed, Wolfe said, and in doing so expose you not just as an ambitious executive, but as one who funded unregulated chemical experiments and funneled those results into a market-adjacent product line. Foley shook his head slowly. All speculation. But timed with precision, Wolfe replied. Glennie's sudden death removed the dissenting voice. The altered surveillance logs concealed the substitution of compound batches. The janitor's bribe scrubbed the last visible record. And the poison test sample, cloaked in caramel, fitting for a company that believes deception should come sugar-coated. Kramer stood straighter. That enough for you to make an arrest, Wolfe? Soon, Wolfe said, when we've examined not just why, but how. Melinda's voice cut in softly. You knew he'd tested alone. Warm. You knew. Foley said nothing. But his silence at that moment spoke louder than any plea. Wolfe adjusted slightly in his chair, which in his universe signaled thunder on the horizon. Now, he said, let us consider the how. He gestured toward the silver dish again, where remnants of the infamous batch lay sealed beneath glass, like museum artifacts. Fritz had insisted on preserving every trace, whether out of scientific curiosity or revenge by restraint. I didn't ask, Wolfe continued. We speak not of arsenic in brandy or strychnine in tea. That is vulgar. This was subtle, intellectual, a microdose embedded within a compound rarely questioned. Caramel. Specifically, a gourmet caramel, dense and slow to melt. Masking agents included cocoa butter and Himalayan salt. Kramer looked skeptical. Salt helps kill people now? No, Wolfe replied. It helps distract them. This batch, when warmed, whether by sunlight, breath, or steam, released a binding agent, not a toxin by itself, but a catalyst that activated the embedded payload. A two-step flavor trap, he pointed at Foley. A mechanism brilliant enough for market success, had it not been paired with homicide. Foley shifted. You have no proof I developed that compound. No, Wolfe agreed, but I have proof it did not come through the approved pipeline. Melinda Crisp's notes show no trace. Dr. Glenn's testing log ends the moment he received the altered batch, and the test samples recovered from the off-site lab, thank you, Mr. Panzer, contain residues not found in the company's public inventory. Saul gave a small nod. And the delivery method? I asked. Precision, Wolfe said. A limited batch, a friendly note. A package sent not as a gift, but as a silencer. Foley said nothing, but his fingers began tapping on the armrest. A man without a tune, playing for time. Had Glenn consumed it as intended, Wolfe went on, his death would have been tragic and untraceable, a fluke. Kramer scratched his chin. But he didn't? No, Wolfe said, and this time his tone chilled. Someone else did. And with that, we reached the kernel at the center of it all. Wolfe turned toward Fritz, not with drama, but with something that resembled gravity, which, coming from Wolfe, is about as close to sentiment as you're going to get. You tasted it first. Fritz bowed slightly, still stiff in posture, but calm in voice. I chilled it, then served a single piece. I noticed a bitterness. I did not swallow more. And that saved you, Wolfe said, from what was meant for another. Melinda stared. It wasn't supposed to go to him? No, Wolfe said. It was meant for Glenna. The package was addressed to him originally, digitally redirected at the last moment. A clever sleight, but not clever enough. He reached into his drawer and withdrew a printed delivery confirmation, courtesy of Saul's quiet visit to the shipping platform. A small, damning detail, the tracking log showed a manual edit. Time stamped to a minute after Glenna's calendar showed a meeting cancellation. Someone had seized a moment of opportunity. Kramer's eyes narrowed. So Fritz was the accidental victim? Not victim, Wolfe corrected. Target misplaced. He turned to Foley. That was your blunder. You allowed an underling to execute a plan based on assumptions. You presumed Glenn would test the batch at his desk on schedule, but he deferred it. One of his peculiar habits, Melinda whispered. He always did that on Thursdays. Said flavors required distance. And in that window, Wolfe said, the package was rerouted. Foley clenched his jaw. Coincidence? No, Wolfe replied coldly. Consequence. He gestured at Fritz once more. My chef, who has fed me for 2 decades without error. He trusted that tin, not for its label, but because it was sent to him. I said. And because of that trust, he nearly took Glenay's place in the morgue. Kramer stood. That's it. That's your motive, your method, your mistake. Foley didn't speak. He didn't have to. His face had turned the color of overcooked caramel, and his silence was all the confession we'd ever need. It's a peculiar thing, watching a guilty man pivot. At first, they deny, then they rationalize, and when the structure collapses, they deflect. Foley, cornered and silent for nearly 4 minutes, chose the third path. She helped me, he said suddenly, loud enough to fracture the stillness. She gave me Glenay's testing notes. She knew what I was doing. All heads turned to Melinda, whose eyes widened, not in surprise, but in disbelief. That's a lie, she whispered. You gave me the samples, Foley barked. You said Glenay would ruin everything. You were part of it until you realized it might hurt you. No, she stood, clutching her bag, voice breaking. I gave you flavor notes. You said it was to revise the formula. Semantics, he said coldly. Lies, Wolfe corrected. And poorly constructed ones. Melinda unzipped her bag and pulled out a thin folder, creased at the corners, marked by indecision and sleepless nights. I didn't want to use this, she said, but I made copies of everything I gave him, and emails, dates, timestamps. It proves I didn't know about the compound. She handed it to me. I scanned the top page, her hand-written marginalia, dates matching company records, and one damning line in Foley's handwriting. Modify per Glenay's template. Test discreetly. Wolfe said nothing. He didn't have to. Foley's breath hitched, only slightly, but enough to shift the air. Kramer stepped forward. You want to revise your statement? Foley swallowed. I didn't mean to kill Glenn, Kramer snapped, or to get caught. Foley dropped into the chair like a man 3 feet from a cliff's edge who'd finally looked down. Melinda stood frozen, eyes glassy, but clear. You used me, she said. He didn't deny it. Wolfe leaned back. Greed has many flavors, Mr. Foley, but none so bitter as its residue. And with that, the game was over. There was no need for further dramatics. Kramer, who had remained unnaturally patient throughout Wolfe's rhetorical performance, now moved with military efficiency. He drew a pair of handcuffs from his coat as though they were theater tickets. Quentin Foley, he said, you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction, and the murder of Dr. Noah Glenn. Foley stood slowly. You won't make this stick. Kramer gave him a look, drier than any legal textbook. We've got your ghost janitor, your secret lease, your erased logs, and your caramelized coincidence that nearly killed Wolfe's chef. He clamped the cuffs on Foley's wrists with just enough force to make a point. Saul stepped away from the bookcase and opened the door. Wolfe nodded his approval, which for Wolfe bordered on jubilation. Melinda watched Foley being led out with a mixture of relief and emotional fatigue. Wolfe caught her expression and addressed her, not gently, but not unkindly. Miss Crisp, he said, if you wish to pursue a future in food chemistry, I suggest you do so with less tolerance for ambition unmoored by ethics. She gave a small, grateful nod. Thank you, Mr. Wolfe. He didn't respond. Praise, like sugar, was best used sparingly. When the door closed behind Foley, Wolfe exhaled, a rare gesture of release. That man, he muttered, had the palate of a chain-smoking magpie. The house was quiet again, that special kind of quiet you only get after someone tries to murder your chef with a gourmet snack and is escorted out in irons. Fritz returned to the kitchen and began sterilizing everything with such grim efficiency that I briefly wondered whether the brownstone would ever see another carbohydrate. Wolfe retreated to the dining room, not for dinner, but for reflection. I followed him in because some moments shouldn't be wasted on solitude. He sat at the head of the table, arms folded, a bowl of peeled grapes before him, untouched. "You could eat something else," I offered. "Fritz made a saffron risotto." "No," Wolfe said. "I'm not in the mood for starch." I waited, then said, "You know it wasn't the popcorn." "Of course it wasn't," he snapped. "It was the men who believe food is a weapon and integrity is seasoning." "Well, Fritz is cleared." "He was never not cleared." "You going to tell him that?" Wolfe gave me a look. "I will give him the only apology that matters. I will continue to eat what he prepares." I grinned. "And the popcorn?" "There will be no popcorn." "Forever?" "Forever." A pause. "Even during movie nights?" "There are no movie nights." I leaned back. "Suit yourself." Fritz arrived silently, placed a small dish of olives beside Wolfe, and gave me a look that said he appreciated my effort, even if Wolfe didn't. As he turned to leave, Wolfe spoke, not loudly. "Fritz." "Yes, sir?" "I owe you a cutting, the new Phalaenopsis hybrid, on the orchid shelf." Fritz stopped, bowed slightly, then left with a dignity that made me feel like the butler in a forgotten Shakespeare play. Later, as I cleared the table, I glanced at the tin still sealed in the corner cabinet. No one touched it, and I knew no one ever would. Wolfe had spoken. The war on popcorn was permanent, but, as always, the house had survived. And justice, though rarely sweet, had been served. The following morning, the brownstone had resumed its usual rhythms, measured, meticulous, and immune to outside interference. The orchids were misted, the mail was sorted, and Nero Wolfe was back in his chair, settled behind the globe, like a man who had just endured a siege and had the gall to win it without rising from his fortress. Breakfast, served precisely at 9, consisted of lightly scrambled eggs, toasted brioche, and a small porcelain bowl of peeled white grapes, Fritz's new culinary placeholder for the late, unlamented popcorn. Wolfe peered at them with faint approval. "Acceptable," he murmured, texturally soothing. "Less likely to kill you?" I offered. He didn't dignify that with a response which was as close as he ever came to conceding a joke. Fritz remained quiet throughout the meal, but his eyes lingered on Wolfe longer than usual. I could tell he was watching for some signal, a nod, a phrase, a lift of an eyebrow. Instead, Wolfe simply reached for his coffee and spoke without looking up. "I've annotated the orchid ledger. The new hybrid may be relocated to your care." Fritz paused. "The Vanda Paphiopedilum cross?" "Yes." "Very good, sir." No further words were exchanged. None were needed. In Wolfe's world, trust was rarely expressed and never refused, but when it bloomed, it did so like his orchids, unexpectedly, and in perfect, dignified silence. Wolfe's orchid room is sacred territory, an enclosed jungle of temperature-controlled diplomacy, where roots hang like rumors and petals open with more integrity than most people I've met. That afternoon, he invited Fritz in for precisely 11 minutes. I wasn't allowed, naturally, but I heard later that the handoff of the orchid cutting was done with the formality of a royal pardon. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't warm, but it mattered. Later, over tea, Wolfe addressed it with me, not out of sentiment but due process. "He's not merely competent," Wolfe said, eyes on the teacup. "He is irreplaceable." "For Fritz," I said, "that's practically a love letter." Wolfe grimaced. "Don't be grotesque." But he was pleased, in his way. The tin of poisoned popcorn had been locked in the pantry vault and marked untouchable, not even for evidence. A custom label Fritz insisted on. The orchids, meanwhile, flourished. Wolfe spent the remainder of the day cataloguing soil pH fluctuations and dictating a memo to a food safety watchdog group he didn't actually intend to send. It was, as far as I could tell, a form of moral flossing. He never mentioned Melinda Crisp again, nor Foley. And when Saul dropped off a package from the prosecutor's office, a thank you and a quietly phrased request for cooperation in a future matter, Wolfe said only, "They can wait." The orchids apparently could not. By nightfall the brownstone was quiet again, save for the faint rustle of orchid leaves and the occasional clink of porcelain as Fritz prepared an infallibly safe dessert, poached pears, no caramel. I was in the office, feet up on the corner of Wolfe's desk, flipping through the now-closed case file labelled Golden Kernel Incident, Internal. The incident, I reflected, had nearly cost us our cook, our dignity, and Wolfe's ability to trust anything packaged in foil. "Never liked popcorn," I muttered. "You ate 3 handfuls," Wolfe replied from behind the dictionary. "I was vetting the danger." He sniffed. "You were being gluttonous." I grinned and stood. Well, the case is closed, Glenay's name cleared, Fritz redeemed, and popcorn permanently blacklisted. "I never blacklisted it," Wolfe said. I paused. "I merely eradicated it." I gave him a mock salute. "You're a pillar of culinary jurisprudence." He made a noise that might have been approval or indigestion. Hard to tell with Wolfe. As I headed for the front door, coat over my arm, I paused to toss one final line over my shoulder. "Next time someone tries to murder us with dessert, I vote we let Saul taste it first." Wolfe didn't respond, but I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch. Outside, the night was crisp, quiet, and, thankfully, snack-free. But something told me, as always, it wouldn't stay that way. Because in New York, there's always a new flavor of trouble popping up. And Wolfe, he'll never taste it. But me? Well, I crunched the risk so Wolfe doesn't have to. Case closed.